Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch, your daily dose of raw liberty, streaming online at foxnews.com. I'm your host, Judge Andrew Napolitano, here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. Today's Freedom Watch is our last until we return from Christmas break the week of January 4th. When we began Freedom Watch a year ago, we never expected the reaction we received from all of you. I want to thank each and every one of you for supporting Freedom Watch and for supporting me. We went from 1 day a week live show on foxnews.com's Strategy Room to a 3-day a week video on demand format. We continue to work hard on developing Freedom Watch, and we hope to bring you some exciting news on the future of Freedom Watch as soon as we return in January. During the course of the past year, we've been able to discuss topics once considered taboo on television, like fiat currency and abolishing the Federal Reserve and legalizing recreational drugs, abolishing the income tax, even seceding from the Union. I trust we've educated you on the government's excesses and its abuses, its trampling of the Constitution, and our continued loss of freedom. Today, a Senate panel has approved Ben Bernanke by a vote of 16-7 to serve another 4-year term as the head of the Federal Reserve. Yesterday, Professor Bernanke was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Last week, President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. While the opinions of Time's editors and the Swedish parliament are relatively meaningless, one must ask nevertheless, what have we learned from all of this? As President Obama received his Nobel Peace Prize, he announced an escalation of an undeclared and unlawful war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as Bernanke accepted his award from Time Magazine, he was promising the Senate that in consideration of his renomination, he will get us out of the recession by doing the very same things that got us into the recession. Is anyone holding him accountable for tanking our economy? The Fed continues to print money with the same zeal. Barney Frank is urging the Department of Housing and Urban Development to prop up the same bad mortgages that he helped create with Fannie and Freddie. And the U.S. military and the CIA continue to kill innocents abroad. Is there no end in sight to this madness? Now, that's a lot to talk about. Joining me to discuss all of this is Thomas Woods, author of Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. The best book on the recession you can read. Professor Robert Higgs, author of the classic Crisis and Leviathan, the best study there is on the growth of big government in the modern world. And Professor Joe Salerno, professor of economics at Pace University, who's considered by many to be the greatest living monetary economist in the Austrian tradition. Gentlemen, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Tom, we'll start with you. We bemoan that Ben Bernanke is likely to be reconfirmed. But does it really matter who the chairman is? I mean, if by some act of God, the Senate denied his renomination, wouldn't we get somebody like Larry Summers or Tim Geithner or Sheila Bair or somebody who'd be just as bad as Bernanke has been?
Yeah, we wouldn't get Bob Higgs or Joe Salerno. And in fact, as I told you, Judge, it was actually Joe who was the one who wrote an article years ago saying that when Greenspan goes, maybe this nut Bernanke could be waiting in the wings, and sure enough. But what's more important, I think we all knew Bernanke would be reconfirmed after a little bit of tongue lashing, but what's more significant to me is that Ron Paul, I think, has permanently changed the political landscape in America in that there is now a vocal, articulate, and then also sometimes just loud and obnoxious in the best sense of the word, anti-Fed political constituency. Still very small, but it exists. It's being acknowledged. It's being treated with more respect than I've ever seen. This is a clear change in our political life, and for all the disasters we're seeing that you described going on around us, we can at least take comfort that that is a change, and I think it's a lasting change.
We can say this because we all know him personally and like him as a human being and admire his courage and dedication to first principles. But, Joe, it really is because of the single-minded dedication of Congressman Ron Paul that we are on the cusp of what may very well be a real, true, open audit of the Federal Reserve. If this happens, well, first of all, do you think it will happen, or do you think that they will pull some kind of a string, do something to defy even the Congress if they enact this law and the president signs it because there are other things in the law that he can't really afford to veto?
I'm hopeful that it will come to pass, but I think they'll squeeze out of it in one way or another, or obscure it, or do something that makes it less than fully effective. But I think it's one of the greatest things that could happen. This whole myth that the Fed is independent, will then go by the boards. I mean, we recently heard a few weeks ago Frederick Mishkin, former governor of the Fed and a professor at Columbia University, tell us that transparency can go too far. And all along they've told us that really we have an independent Fed, and the only reason why the Fed can be independent is if it's also accountable to the American people and completely transparent. So let's see it now. Let's see the payoff. Let's see the transparency.
Right.
That's what Ron Paul's asking for, nothing more.
Running throughout crisis and Leviathan, Bob Higgs, is, of course, the specter of the Fed. Now, I've said this to you and to many, many people, and you agree with me. The job of the CIA is to steal and keep secrets. But we know more about the CIA than we do the Fed. What do you imagine, Bob, we would find out if we got a full-blown, not a half-baked, but a full-blown audit of the Fed as a result of congressional legislation?
That's very hard to say, Judge. I think the bill to audit the Fed is aimed not at audit in the usual sense, but at trying to get more information about who has participated in and how they've participated in the discussions that the Fed has prior to making policy decisions. People aren't really without a lot of numerical information about the operations of the Fed. That's already available. But what we don't know is really who the influential parties are. Why do they make these decisions as they make them? And obviously, not very many people can be involved. Otherwise, we would all have known long ago who was doing what. So it would appear that a relatively small number of people have an unknown degree and distribution of influence when the Fed makes its decisions. And that's really what we want to know. Some people strongly suspect that the Fed is being used to protect and enrich and save the cookies of very high rollers on Wall Street and to some extent in other countries. And people want to know who's running the show there. And that is the thing that the Fed really has the greatest interest in concealing. And I don't know whether an audit as such is going to allow us to get at that information or not.
Well, Tom, one of the things that we may learn is that the Fed has been conducting its own foreign policy. I mean, the Fed may very well be engaged in massive financial transactions with central banks of other countries, the essence and nature and amount of which are adverse to freedom or adverse to the safety and security of the United States of America. We have no way of knowing that unless there's a true and full audit. Unless there's a true and full audit, we have no idea, or do we, how much fiat money they're creating out of thin air.
Well, I know that when the initial audit legislation was proposed and the opposition came out against it, they went ahead and listed all the ways in which the Fed is transparent, and one of the things they left out is precisely one of the areas Ron Paul is interested in are the Fed's dealings with foreign central banks and foreign governments,
right,
the details of which are unknown. And I think even beyond that, it is not in any way out of bounds to suspect there is at least a possibility of some kind of interaction between the Federal Reserve and the CIA. I mean, for heaven's sake, if you're conducting a secretive foreign policy and you just happen to have a secretive money creation organization sitting there, I mean, is it absolutely beyond the pale to suppose there might be some kind of interaction? So I suspect it's that there's at least something of this nature going on. I mean, why else would Ben Bernanke and these guys be absolutely white-faced in
right,
terror if they were just afraid we were going to discover a few rounding errors, I don't think they would have that reaction.
Well, Joe, what do you think the American public would how do you think the American public would react if it understood the concept of fiat money, if it understood the concept of the Fed creating money out of thin air, if it understood the way the Fed acquires wealth by giving out funny money but having it paid back in real money? I mean, we basically know that already, and there's no adverse reaction to it.
I think they'd throw all the Fed governors out of the building on their ear if they knew just what the Fed was engaged in. For example, from 2001 to 2005, the buildup of the bubble and so on, the Fed was creating approximately, by back-of-the-envelope calculations, $1 billion of new money per week. They increased the money supply during that period by $2 trillion, or 50%, and then later went on to almost double it. So we created more money just in the last 5 or 6 years than had been created throughout the first however many years of our republic.
Well, you could argue, Bob Higgs, the reason we had the recession of 18 months ago is because the bubble that they created burst. Every time they create a bubble, it bursts. You can almost predict when these things are going to happen. So why should we let Ben Bernanke and company create another bubble so that we have an artificial sense of wealth creation and prices start going up and people are buying and selling and buying and selling, and then we'll have another recession again?
Well, unfortunately, Judge, I think a lot of people, including some very well-placed people, such as Paul Krugman, are actually in favor of creating another bubble. In their minds, a bubble is just a period of prosperity, and they don't really understand why creating a bubble is not a viable policy for the longer run. They don't understand that these bubbles are inevitably going to collapse at some point, and there's a lot of a half-baked theory behind these people. If you read Paul Krugman again, you get what I call vulgar Keynesianism in its pure form.
You know, they both taught it to Princeton. Bubbles. They both taught at Princeton together, but Krugman is so out there. I mean, he almost makes Bernanke sound like Hayek by comparison.
Oh, he certainly does.
And I'm a graduate of Princeton. These guys, of course, weren't there. They're my age. They weren't professors when I was there. But it's loony, the stuff that passes for sound economic theory today. I mean, just think about it. We know that this recession was caused by too much borrowing and spending, too much involvement by the federal government in the real estate and mortgage market, the federal government taking the risk, telling bankers to loan all this money, sell this bad paper to us. They're on the cusp of doing the same thing all over again.
It's not just the cusp, Judge. They are doing the same thing over again. And not only has the Fed created all this enormous new monetary base that's now sitting in the bank reserves, but the government has continued in a variety of ways to try to force or influence or persuade financial institutions, many of which it controls directly or indirectly through its control of Fannie and Freddie,
right,
to bring about more making of bad mortgages of exactly the same kind that created the real estate bubble in the first part of this decade.
Right. Congressman Barney Frank is actually encouraging the Federal Housing Authority, which I gather is a branch of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to make mortgages available to people who are too poor to pay them. Tom Woods, doesn't that sound familiar?
That's what they call affordable housing in the government.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. What in fact is going on is over the past year, they've actually doubled the amount of the loans that the FHA will be permitted to insure, and now Barney Frank wants to pass legislation increasing that amount by another 100,000, so that the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it is to provide affordable housing for low-income people, will be able to insure mortgages of over $800,000 of people who are making 3.5% down payments and who are going into debt to make that down payment.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit because it's the end of the year. It's almost Christmas. I want to fantasize a little bit. I want to fantasize that we abolish the income tax. What would happen, Joe Salerno, A, to the economy, and B, to the federal government if we abolish the income tax?
I think it would be a great thing. The personal income tax really only accounts for 50% of tax revenues or thereabouts. It would force the federal government to pare back on its spending. I mean, the key is the spending, as Milton Friedman pointed out a long time ago. Spending is taxation by another name. They're sucking resources out of the real economy. If we cut the income taxes, we would have much more saving. We'd have true growth, a lot more of it, and the prospects of a huge deficit at that point would force the government to cut back on spending and allow resources to flow back into the private sector and to get our economy going again, but in a genuine way.
Bob Higgs, how was the federal government financed? And I'm not talking about what Lincoln did during the Civil War, but for the most part, how was the federal government financed before there was an income tax? Where'd they get their cash from?
Overwhelmingly, the federal government's revenue came from tariff revenues, Judge, and in the first half of the 19th century, a substantial chunk came from sales of public lands. But from our beginning in the 18th century up until really the 1920s, or World War I at all events, the tariff was the primary source of revenue for the federal government.
Wow. What would happen to the federal government, Tom, as we understand it today, if they didn't have the bottomless pit of pliant taxpayers? And I'm not critical of taxpayers for paying their taxes. Everybody should pay their taxes because the government will put you in jail if you don't, no matter how unreasonable and rapacious the tax rates may be. But what would happen to the federal government if they didn't have the bottomless pit of individual taxpayers to tap into?
Well, of course, they'd try to substitute by more borrowing and more printing, but the limits of that would become even more obvious, I think. And so what instead would happen is inevitably there would be cuts, and the thing they most fear isn't the cuts, but the fact that the people would realize that we didn't need any of this stuff to start with. I mean, do we need thousands and thousands of bureaucrats at the Department of the Transportation who are making six-figure incomes at a time like this? We've got federal salaries and employment going up when everybody else is suffering. So this is a parasitical body, and if half of these budgets, three-quarters of these budgets were slashed and these employees were let go, instead of being parasites on the economy, they'd have to go make things. They'd have to be productive members of the economy. We'd see an increase in growth and wealth,
right.
And suddenly we'd realize, wait a minute, we've been totally scammed.
All right, indulge my fantasy a little bit more, gentlemen. I'd like each of you to give me a prediction. We'll start with Bob Higgs. Give me a prediction of something bad you think is going to happen, and give me a prediction of something good that you think is going to happen between now and a year from now.
I suspect a number of bad things will happen, Judge. I will very confidently forecast that the amount of federal spending is going to be greater even than now forecasted, and probably the bad thing that will happen is that the current recession will, if there's any recovery at all, experience only a very, very weak recovery. So I think what we're looking at now is a very long, sustained period of weak economic activity, possibly combined sooner or later with accelerating inflation. So I think the bad threat right now is for some serious stagflation.
All right, that's not bad and good. That's bad and really bad. Joe Salerno, your predictions for the next year in this area of human behavior.
I think we're going to see more inflation of consumer prices breaking out in the next year, and stagflation, as Bob has said. That's the bad thing that I fear, and even greater deficits, at least in the short run, as they try to keep us from relapsing back into this sort of financial depression. But I think the good thing that might come out of all this is that people are going to be fed up, that maybe the sentiment will build for having for this audit. Maybe the Ron Paul audit bill will get through.
Tom Woods.
Well, my bad predictions are, they basically stole mine. But for my good prediction, because I think we have the same sort of analysis. But my prediction for good is that I think Rand Paul is actually going to be elected to the U.S. Senate, and I think the presence of somebody like him and the presence of his father, at least they have the potential to be great teachers to the American public, and we sorely need those.
Well, I am speaking to three great teachers now: Joe Salerno, Bob Higgs, Tom Woods. It's a pleasure. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. We'll see you on Freedom Watch after the break. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.